The mountain man warned the obese girl never to come to his cabin. At night, she did anyway and uncovered his truth. The settlement of Crow's Hollow huddled at the base of the Appalachian foothills like a collection of wooden toys scattered by a careless child. It was 1794, and the town consisted of perhaps 40 souls: trappers, traders, a blacksmith, a preacher who doubled as the schoolmaster, and a handful of families trying to carve civilization from the wilderness. Beyond the last cabin, the forest rose dark and impenetrable, a wall of pine and oak that seemed to breathe with ancient secrets. Everyone in Crow's Hollow knew about the mountain man. His name was Jonah Briggs, though most folks just called him the Hermit, or that strange fellow in the high woods. He lived 3 miles up the mountain trail in a cabin he'd built with his own hands, far enough from town that you had to want to find him to make the journey. Jonah came down once a month for supplies: flour, salt, lamp oil, sometimes tobacco, and he paid in furs and wild ginseng root that fetched good prices with the traders heading east. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, with a thick black beard shot through with premature gray despite being only 32 years old. His eyes were the color of river stones, and he had a way of looking at you that made some folks uncomfortable, as if he could see straight through to whatever you were hiding. Most people gave him a wide berth. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts when he passed. The men nodded politely but kept their distance. Clara Hutchins was different. At 19, Clara was what the town's crueler tongues called a heavy girl, and what the kinder ones described as pleasantly round. She had struggled with her weight since childhood, and in a frontier settlement where physical labor was constant and food often scarce, her size made her an oddity. The other young women whispered about her, and the young men looked past her as if she were invisible. Her father had died 2 winters ago from pneumonia, and her mother had followed him 6 months later, worn down by grief and the endless work of frontier life. Clara lived alone now in her parents' small cabin on the eastern edge of town, supporting herself by taking in mending and doing laundry for the families who could afford such luxuries. She had a quick mind and loved to read, a passion that was unusual for a frontier girl and one that set her even further apart from her peers. It was this love of reading that first brought her into contact with Jonah Briggs. She had been walking in the woods one afternoon in early spring, following the creek upstream while reading a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress that had belonged to her father. She'd been so absorbed in the book that she hadn't noticed how far she'd wandered until she looked up and found herself on an unfamiliar trail. The sun was sinking toward the western ridges, and panic had begun to flutter in her chest when she rounded a bend and saw the cabin. It was solidly built, with a stone chimney and real glass in one window, a luxury on the frontier. Smoke curled from the chimney, and as Clara hesitated on the trail, the door opened and Jonah Briggs stepped out. "You're a long way from town, Miss Hutchins," he had said in his deep, quiet voice. Clara had been surprised that he knew her name. I lost track of time while reading. I'm not sure of the way back." He had studied her for a long moment with those river-stone eyes, then nodded toward the cabin. "Come inside. I'll make you some sassafras tea and point you toward the right trail. It'll be dark soon." That had been the beginning of their unlikely friendship. Over the following months, Clara found herself drawn back to the mountain cabin. Jonah, despite his reputation as a hermit, proved to be surprisingly good company. He had a collection of books, real books, not just the Bible and almanacs that most frontier cabins contained. He had volumes of poetry, natural philosophy, accounts of explorations. He loaned them to Clara freely, and they spent hours discussing what she'd read. Jonah knew about herbs and plants, could identify every bird by its call, understood the patterns of weather and animal behavior. He taught Clara to recognize medicinal plants and shared his knowledge of the forest. When she caught a bad cold that November, he appeared at her door with a poultice that broke her fever and a tea that soothed her cough. "How did you know I was ill?" she had asked, weak and surprised. "Mrs. Reynolds mentioned it when I was in town for supplies," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Thought you might need this." The town noticed, of course. People talked. Some said Clara was making a fool of herself, mooning after a strange hermit who would never be interested in a girl like her. Others whispered darker things, that Jonah was hiding something up in those woods, that no normal man lived so far from civilization unless he had reason to hide. Clara ignored them all. For the first time in her life, she had a friend who saw her as something other than the fat girl whose parents had died. Jonah never commented on her size, never looked at her with pity or disdain. He talked to her about books and ideas, asked her opinion on things, laughed at her observations. When she was with him, she forgot to feel self-conscious. Then came the warning. It was a gray afternoon in late November, with winter's first real cold settling into the valleys. Clara had hiked up to return a book, a volume of John Donne's poetry that had left her breathless with its intensity. Jonah had seemed distracted when she arrived, more quiet than usual. He'd made tea, but kept glancing toward the single window as if expecting something. "Is everything all right?" Clara had finally asked. Jonah had looked at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his face. "Clara," he said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you, or rather, something I need you to promise me." She set down her cup, suddenly nervous. "What is it?" He stood and paced to the window, his large frame tense. "You've been kind to me, kinder than I deserve, probably, and because of that, I need you to make me a promise." "Of course. What kind of promise?" Jonah turned to face her, and his expression was unlike anything she'd seen before, a mixture of fear, pain, and something that might have been shame. "Promise me you'll never come to this cabin at night, no matter what you hear, no matter what you think you hear. Don't come here after dark." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. "Jonah, you're frightening me. What's wrong?" He crossed the room and, for the first time since she'd known him, took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, and his grip was gentle despite his strength. "I can't explain right now. Maybe someday I will, but not yet. Just promise me, Clara, please never come here at night." The intensity in his voice, the desperation in his eyes, she couldn't refuse. "I promise," she whispered. He had walked her most of the way back to town that afternoon, something he'd never done before, as if he needed to make sure she was safely away from the cabin before darkness fell. That had been 3 weeks ago, and Clara hadn't been back since. The promise weighed on her mind constantly. What was Jonah hiding? What happened at his cabin after dark? The questions consumed her, but she had given her word. Until the night, everything changed. The storm rolled in from the west on a December night, bringing sleet that ticked against Clara's shutters like thrown sand. She sat by her small fire, wrapped in a quilt, trying to focus on the mending in her lap. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the lonely cry of wolves. Clara had always found wolf song beautiful in a melancholy way, but tonight it made her uneasy. The howls seemed closer than usual, more insistent. She set aside her mending and went to check that her door was properly barred. As she stood by the door, listening to the storm, she heard something else. A voice, faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. A man's voice calling her name. "Clara! Clara, please!" Her heart lurched. The voice was weak, desperate, and it sounded like Jonah. She pressed her ear to the door, holding her breath. There it was again, more distinct now. "Clara, help me, please!" The voice was coming from the direction of the mountain, from where Jonah's cabin stood. Clara's mind raced. Jonah never came to town at night, but he sounded hurt, terrified. What if he'd been injured? What if he was in danger? The wolves, those howls, had been so close. What if a pack had cornered him? Her hand went to the door's wooden bar, then stopped. "Promise me you'll never come to this cabin at night, no matter what you hear." But this wasn't just a random sound. This was Jonah calling for help. Surely he wouldn't expect her to ignore that. If he was injured, bleeding, dying. "Clara, please, I'm hurt." The anguish in that voice shattered her hesitation. She grabbed her cloak, lit a lantern, and threw open the door. The sleet stung her face as she hurried through the dark settlement. No light showed in the other cabins. Everyone was asleep or huddled by their fires, sensibly staying indoors. Clara's boots slipped on the icy mud as she reached the trailhead and started up the mountain. The climb was treacherous in the dark. Branches whipped at her face, and twice she nearly fell on the slick rocks. Her lantern cast wild shadows that seemed to writhe with malicious intent. The wolves had fallen silent, which was somehow worse than their howling. "Hold on, Jonah," she called into the darkness. "I'm coming." No answer now, just the wind and the creak of trees. Clara's lungs burned by the time she reached the clearing where Jonah's cabin stood. The structure was dark, except for a faint glow of firelight through the window. No smoke came from the chimney, which was strange. Jonah always kept a fire burning. She hurried to the door and pounded on it. "Jonah, it's Clara! Let me in!" Silence. Clara tried the latch. The door swung open. The cabin's interior was lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. Clara held up her lantern, and its light pushed back the shadows to reveal a scene that made her blood freeze. The cabin's main room was as she remembered: the wooden table, the chairs, the shelves of books. But something was different. In the corner where Jonah kept his trapping supplies, she saw a heavy chain bolted to the floor. And at the end of that chain, huddled against the wall, was a man. He was emaciated, his clothes hanging off his frame in rags. His hair and beard were long and matted, his face gaunt with suffering. Iron shackles circled his ankles, connected to the chain by a heavy padlock. When Clara's lantern light fell on him, he looked up with wild, desperate eyes that were the same river-stone gray as Jonah's. Clara took an involuntary step backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The man struggled to his knees, the chain rattling. "Please," he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Please, you have to help me." Who are you?" Clara managed. The man's laugh was bitter and broken. "Who am I? I'm Jonah Briggs, the real Jonah Briggs." Clara's world seemed to tilt. The lantern shook in her hand, sending shadows dancing crazily around the room. "That's not possible. Jonah is—" "The man you know isn't Jonah," the chained man said urgently, struggling to his feet. "That's my brother, my twin brother Eli, and he's kept me prisoner here for 10 years. No. Clara shook her head, backing toward the door. No, you're lying. Jonah isn't. Look at me. The man held out his shackled hands. Look at my face. We're identical twins. Or we were before Eli did this to me, before he stole my life. Clara did look, and her stomach churned with horror. The man's face, beneath the grime and desperation, was indeed identical to Jonah's. The same strong jaw, the same sharp cheekbones, the same gray eyes, though these eyes held a wildness that Jonah's lacked. "Listen to me," the man said, his words tumbling out in desperation. "Eli isn't the gentle hermit he pretends to be. He's dangerous. He did something terrible, and he—" The cabin door crashed open. Clara whirled to see Jonah the Jonah she knew standing in the doorway. He was soaked from the storm, his chest heaving as if he'd been running. His eyes went wide when he saw Clara, and an expression of pure anguish crossed his face. "Clara," he breathed, "you shouldn't be here." "She knows now," the chained man shouted. "She knows what you are, what you did." Jonah stepped into the cabin, moving slowly, his hands held out in a placating gesture. "Clara, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Clara's voice was shrill with panic. She looked between the two identical men, one free, one chained. "Which of you is telling the truth?" "Don't listen to him." The chained man rattled his shackles. "He's a murderer. He killed 12 men at the Harper's Ferry mining camp. They were hunting him, so he imprisoned me and took my identity." "That's a lie." Jonah's voice was sharp, and Clara saw real fear in his eyes. "Clara, please, that man is dangerous. I'm the dangerous one?" The chained man laughed wildly. "I'm the one in shackles. She can see who the monster is here." Clara pressed herself against the wall, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew was crumbling. The gentle mountain man who had shown her kindness, who had discussed poetry and natural philosophy, could he be capable of such deception? But the man in chains, with his wild eyes and desperate voice, could she trust him either? "Jonah," she said, using the only name she knew, speaking to the man standing free. "Tell me the truth, please." Jonah Briggs, the Jonah Clara knew, closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, they glistened with unshed tears. "His name is Ezekiel," Jonah said quietly. "Zeke. He's my older brother by 20 minutes. He moved slowly to the table and lit the lamp there, flooding the cabin with more light. And yes, we're twins." "Lies!" Zeke shouted from his corner. "He's trying to—" "Be quiet!" For the first time, Clara heard real command in Jonah's voice, a hardness that made both her and the chained man fall silent. Jonah turned to Clara, and she had never seen such pain in a person's eyes. "I'll tell you everything," he said. And then you can decide what to believe." He sank into one of the chairs, suddenly looking much older than his 32 years. "Zeke and I grew up in Virginia. Our father was a hunter and trapper, and he taught us his trade. We came west together in '82, looking for new territory, new opportunities. We built this cabin together, worked these woods together." "He's stalling," Zeke muttered, but his voice had lost some of its intensity. Jonah continued, as if his brother hadn't spoken. "Zeke was always troubled. Even as children he had rages. He'd hurt animals, pick fights, break things. Our mother used to say he had the devil in him. But he was my brother, my twin, and I always defended him, always made excuses." Clara found herself sitting down in the other chair, though she kept the table between herself and Jonah. What happened? In the spring of '84, Zeke went to work at a mining camp about 15 miles north of here. Harper's Ferry Camp, they called it. I stayed here working the trap lines. We'd agreed to try separate paths for a while. Jonah's hands clenched on the table. 3 weeks later, I went to visit him, to see how he was doing. The cabin was silent except for the pop of embers in the fireplace and the rattle of Zeke's chains as he shifted position. When I got there, Jonah continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the camp was gone, not abandoned, destroyed. There were bodies, Clara, 12 men, some shot, some killed with an axe. The place looked like a slaughterhouse. They deserved it, Zeke's voice cracked. They were stealing from me, cheating me out of my wages. They docked your pay because you kept starting fights, Jonah said wearily, as if they'd had this argument 1,000 times. $2. They docked you $2, and you slaughtered them for it. Clara felt bile rise in her throat. And you found him there? Jonah nodded. He was sitting in the middle of it all, covered in blood, laughing. When he saw me, he said, "Hello, brother." They got what was coming to them. That's when I knew I'd been making excuses for him my whole life, but this was beyond anything I could ignore. You should have let them hang me like a man, Zeke spat. They would have. Jonah looked at his brother with infinite sadness. If they'd found you, but they didn't find you, Zeke. They found me. Clara's breath caught. What? We're identical, Jonah said simply. When the authorities came to investigate, and they did eventually, though it took weeks in this wilderness, they were looking for one of the Briggs twins. No one could tell us apart. By the time they arrived, I'd brought Zeke back here. I told them I was Ezekiel Briggs, and I'd been working here alone all spring. I gave them Jonah Briggs me as the guilty party. Why? Clara whispered. Because he's a fool, Zeke shouted. A soft-hearted fool who... Because you're my brother, Jonah said quietly. Because our mother made me promise before she died to look after you. Because I thought maybe here, away from people, you might get better. I thought I could help you. He looked down at his hands, large, strong hands that Clara had always thought of as gentle. For 6 years, I tried. I kept you here. I tried to help you control your rages. I brought you books, food, everything you needed. But it didn't work. The rages got worse. You'd scream all night, promising to kill me when you got free, promising to kill anyone who came near. And you believed him? Zeke appealed to Clara. He's keeping me prisoner. I'm the victim here. Jonah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather journal. He slid it across the table to Clara. This is Zeke's diary, from before Harper's Ferry. Read it. You'll see what he really is. Clara opened the journal with trembling hands. The first few entries were mundane notes about weather, trapping, daily chores. But as she flipped through the pages, the content changed. Dark fantasies of violence, detailed descriptions of how Zeke wanted to hurt the men at the mining camp, plans for revenge over petty slights. The handwriting became more erratic, the content more disturbing. The final entry, dated April 15, 1784, read, "They'll pay tomorrow, all of them. I'll make them scream. I'll make them beg. And Jonah will never know. He thinks I'm the good one. He has no idea what I'm capable of." Clara closed the journal, feeling sick. He's lying. Zeke's voice had risen to a shriek. He wrote that. He's framing me. But Clara could see the truth now, written in Jonah's exhausted face. in the careful way he kept himself between her and his brother, in the weathered shackles that showed years of use. She thought of all the times Jonah had seemed sad, all the weight he seemed to carry. She'd thought it was just the loneliness of a hermit's life. "The voice," she said suddenly. "Tonight I heard someone calling my name, begging for help. It sounded like you." Jonah's expression grew even more pained. "That's why I warned you never to come at night. Zeke has learned to imitate my voice perfectly. He calls out, pretending to need help, hoping to lure someone up here. If anyone freed him." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I would have heard her," Zeke said, and his voice was suddenly calm, matter-of-fact. The wildness had drained from his eyes, replaced by something colder and more frightening. "Just like I hurt all the others who deserved it. Your little fat friend here, with her books and her kind smiles, I would have enjoyed making her scream." The casual cruelty in those words made Clara's blood run cold. This was the truth, she realized. Not the desperate prisoner, but this cold-eyed man who spoke of violence like others spoke of the weather. Jonah stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "Clara, you need to leave. Now. Go back to town and forget you ever saw this." "Forget?" She looked up at him. "How can I forget? Jonah, you've been living with this for 10 years, keeping him prisoner, protecting the settlement from him, taking on his crimes as your own identity." She stood as well, moving around the table. "You've been alone with this burden for a decade." "It's my burden to carry," Jonah said. "He's my brother, my responsibility." "That's not right," Clara said softly. "No one should have to carry something like this alone." For a long moment, they stood looking at each other. In Jonah's eyes, Clara saw a loneliness and pain so profound it made her heart ache. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything, his identity, his freedom, his chance at a normal life, to protect others from his brother's madness. "Why did you befriend me?" she asked suddenly. "If you were trying to keep people away, why did you let me get close?" Jonah looked away, a flush creeping up his neck. "Because you were kind to me," he said quietly. "Because you looked at me like I was a person, not a strange hermit to be avoided. Because when you talked about books and ideas, I could pretend, just for a little while, that I was a normal man with a normal life." He met her eyes again. "I was selfish. I shouldn't have let it happen. It put you in danger." "I'm glad you did," Clara said, and she meant it. "How touching," Zeke said from his corner, his voice dripping with mockery. "The hermit and the fat girl, a perfect pair of society's rejects." "Shut up, Zeke," Jonah said wearily. "Why should I? It's entertaining, watching my soft-hearted brother moon over a woman who wouldn't give him a second glance if she knew what he really was." Zeke rattled his chains. "Tell her, Jonah. Tell her what you've done in my name." Clara looked at Jonah questioningly. He sighed. "When I took on Zeke's identity, I also had to take on the reputation of the man they were hunting. Jonah Briggs, the me that officially existed, was wanted for the Harper's Ferry massacre. To maintain the fiction that I was Ezekiel, I had to sometimes play the part, act suspicious, keep people at arm's length, let them think I was hiding something so they'd never question whether I might be hiding someone." "You mean you let them think you were the killer?" Clara said slowly. "Not explicitly, but I didn't correct them when they assumed. The rumors, the whispers about the strange hermit in the woods I let them spread, it kept people away. It kept Zeke safe. and the settlement safer. You sacrificed your reputation, Clara said, made yourself into a monster in their eyes to hide the real monster. I did what I had to do, and you've been doing it alone for 10 years. Jonah shrugged helplessly. What choice did I have? You could have turned him in, Clara said, told the truth, and watched them hang my brother? Jonah's voice cracked. Watch them put a noose around a neck identical to mine? Clara, he's sick. He was born wrong in the head somehow. It's not his fault, not really. How could I sentence him to death for something he couldn't control? He killed 12 men, Clara said. How many more would he kill if he got free? Which is why he'll never get free, Jonah said with terrible finality. I made my choice 10 years ago. I'll carry this burden until one of us dies. Clara looked at the man in chains, Ezekiel, not Jonah, and saw him watching them with those cold, calculating eyes. She thought about what he'd said, about hurting her, and knew with chilling certainty that he meant every word. Then she looked at Jonah, the real Jonah. She now knew and saw a good man being crushed under an impossible weight. No, she said. Both brothers looked at her. No, Jonah repeated. Clara straightened her shoulders. No, you won't carry this alone anymore. I'm going to help you. Clara, you can't. I can and I will. She held up a hand to forestall his protest. Not by keeping him prisoner, that's your decision to make, and I understand why you made it. But you need someone who knows the truth, someone to talk to share the burden with. You've been alone with this for too long. If people find out, they won't. Not from me. Clara met his eyes steadily. I'm good at keeping secrets, Jonah. I've kept the secret of my own loneliness well enough. I can keep yours too. Jonah stared at her, and Clara saw hope kindle in his eyes, fragile and tentative, like a candle flame in a draught. You'd do that? Even knowing what he is? What I've done? Especially knowing what you've done, Clara said. You're not a monster, Jonah. You're a man who made an impossible choice and has been paying for it ever since. But you don't have to pay alone anymore. How touching, Zeke sneered. But tell me, brother, how long before she realizes what a mistake she's making? How long before she sees that you're just as damaged as I am? You think keeping me chained up makes you the good one. You think she'll still look at you with those cow eyes when she understands what you really are? Be quiet, Zeke, Jonah said, but there was no force behind it. Clara turned to face the chained man. I know exactly what your brother is, she said firmly. He's a man with the strength to do what needed to be done, even when it cost him everything. He's a man who has protected this settlement for 10 years from a danger they don't even know exists. He's a man who sacrificed his own identity to spare his brother from the noose. She took a step toward Zeke, anger making her bold. And yes, I look at him with admiration, because he's 10 times the man you could ever be, chains or no chains. Zeke's face contorted with rage. You stupid fat— Enough! Jonah's voice rang out like a gunshot. He crossed to his brother, and for a moment Clara thought he might strike him. Instead, he knelt down and looked Zeke in the eyes. You will not speak to her that way. You will not speak to her at all. Do you understand me? The two brothers stared at each other, identical faces reflecting such different souls. Finally, Zeke looked away. Jonah stood and turned back to Clara. You should go. It's late, and the storm is getting worse. I'll walk you back to— What about him? Clara nodded toward Zeke. You can't leave him here alone after this. I've left him alone every day for 10 years. But now I've seen him. Now he knows I know. That changes things." Clara thought for a moment. "You need someone to watch him sometimes, don't you? When you have to go to town, when you need supplies. That's why you built these chains so strong, why you have 3 different locks. But it must be terrifying, leaving him alone, wondering if he'll find a way free." Jonah didn't deny it. "Then let me help," Clara said. "I can come up during the day sometimes when you need to be away. I can make sure he's secure, that he has food and water. You won't have to worry so much." "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." They stood looking at each other while the storm rattled the windows and Zeke watched from his corner with unreadable eyes. Finally, Jonah spoke. "Why? Why would you do this?" Clara smiled sadly. "Because I know what it's like to be alone, Jonah, to feel like you're carrying something too heavy with no one to help share the weight. You gave me kindness when I needed it. Let me return the favor." Jonah did walk Clara back to town that night, leaving Zeke secured with extra chains and locks. They barely spoke during the journey. There was too much to process, too many emotions running too high. At her door, Clara turned to him. "Come by tomorrow, during the day. We need to talk about everything." Jonah nodded. "Clara, I'm sorry for lying to you, for putting you in danger, for—" "You did what you had to do," Clara interrupted. "I understand that now. Tomorrow, Jonah. We'll talk tomorrow." She watched him disappear into the darkness, his large frame swallowed by the storm, and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. The next day dawned clear and bitterly cold. Clara spent the morning doing her usual chores, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the previous night. By noon, when Jonah knocked on her door, she had made her decision. "Come in," she said. "I made coffee." They sat at her small table, the silence awkward at first. Finally, Clara spoke. "Tell me about him, the real him, before Harper's Ferry." Jonah wrapped his large hands around the coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. "He wasn't always like that. Or maybe he was, and I just didn't want to see it. When we were children, he was intense. Everything was either wonderful or terrible, with nothing in between. He'd be your best friend one moment and hate you the next. But he was your brother. He was my twin. We shared a womb, were born minutes apart. You can't understand what that's like unless you've lived it. We were 2 halves of one whole, or that's how it felt." Jonah stared into his coffee. "After our father died, it got worse. Zeke started having these rages where he'd break things, hurt animals. Our mother tried everything, prayer, discipline, different doctors. Nothing helped. And then you came west together. I thought getting away from Virginia might help him. Fresh start, new territory, just the 2 of us. For a while, it seemed to work. But then he trailed off. Then Harper's Ferry," Clara finished. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Clara asked the question that had been bothering her since the previous night. "The voice I heard, calling my name. How did he know to use my name?" Jonah looked uncomfortable. "He hears things. When I come back from town, when I'm talking to myself while I work, he's heard me say your name, probably more than I realized." "You talk about me?" A flush crept up Jonah's neck. "Sometimes, when I'm alone, working the trap lines or splitting wood, it helps to talk about something good, someone good." Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the cold cabin. "I talk about you too," she admitted, "or I did, before people made it clear they thought I was being foolish. They're right to think that, Jonah said quietly. Clara, you should stay away from me, from all of this. You're risking your reputation, your safety. My reputation? Clara laughed, though there was no humor in it. Jonah, I'm the fat girl whose parents died and left her alone. I do laundry and mending to survive. My reputation isn't something I need to protect. I barely have one to begin with. Don't say that. It's true, but that's not the point. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The point is, for the first time in my life, I have a friend. A real friend who sees me as a person, not a burden or an oddity. You did that. You gave me that. Now let me be your friend in return. Jonah turned his hand over, threading his fingers through hers. His hand was warm and rough, and Clara felt something shift in her chest at the contact. You don't know what you're taking on, he said. Then tell me. Explain what you need, how this works. We'll figure it out together. And so they talked. Jonah explained his routine, checking the chains twice daily, bringing food and water, the schedule he'd developed over 10 years of imprisonment. He showed her the journal where he kept notes on Zeke's mental state, his rages, his periods of relative calm. He explained the locks, the security measures, the emergency procedures if Zeke ever did break free. You've thought of everything, Clara said, looking through the detailed notes. I've had 10 years to think about it. Jonah's expression was bleak. 10 years of living in fear that I'll make a mistake, that he'll escape, that he'll hurt someone. 10 years of knowing that I'm just as guilty as he is because I'm keeping him alive when he should have hanged. You're not guilty, Clara said firmly. You're protecting people, including your brother, from himself. Sometimes I wonder if that's true. Sometimes I think I'm just too much of a coward to do what needs to be done. Clara squeezed his hand. It's not cowardice to choose mercy, Jonah. It's courage. The easy thing would have been to turn him in. What you've done, taking on his identity, accepting the suspicion and isolation, that's one of the bravest things I've ever heard of. Jonah looked at her with such naked hope and gratitude that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, he whispered, for not running away, for understanding. Thank you, she replied, for trusting me with the truth.